In this video, we're going to be creating and connecting to an Azure SQL database. Hello, I'm Philip Burton of idodata.com. In this video, which is taken from my DP900 course, we'll be creating an Azure account, and then we'll be installing an Azure SQL database with sample data on the cloud and then querying it. So for more information about my DP900 course, there is a link to this course in the description of this video. And now, please enjoy. So now let's get our free account. And you can see an ad at the top, azure.microsoft.com account free. Though you could just Google Azure free credit and see what you get as well. So let's click on that and you can see we have a start for free, quite enticing button at the top. So what is it you get? You get 12 months of certain services, $200 to be used in the first 30 days, and 25 or more services which are always free. And you can see what services are free. For instance, a virtual machine can be free for 750 hours. So what's that? That's about a month. So free each month for 12 months. However, bear in mind that that's not necessarily the same as storage. So you'll find that there is, I think, storage down here, but very minimal if there is. But you also notice SQL databases free for 250 gigabytes. Now there's a storage 5 gigabytes of file storage and 5 gigabytes of something that's called blob storage. So we'll have a look at what those are as part of this course. So it's worth getting. Now, I should point out that if you go over any limits, you will have to pay. And unfortunately, I can't be held responsible for any expenses that you have. But I will be showing how to pause certain resources. So when you pause it, it doesn't necessarily cost you any money. So I'm going to click Start for Free. And you can see we're now at the Sign Up page. So first of all, I need to enter some details. So there's a bit of waiting, and you'll find this to be quite often a thing that happens, unfortunately, with Microsoft Azure. There will be a fair bit of waiting. Now, you don't actually have to do for this certification anything practical in Microsoft Azure. You just need to learn about it. However, I do find that it's actually quite good to actually do, and then you've got a better visual memory of what each of these particular services are. So you can see it's inviting me to take an identity verification by card. So yes, and there's agreement. Yes, I do want to agree to the subscription agreement, offer details, privacy statement, worth reading. I don't want Microsoft to share my information with select partners though it is interesting to get information about Azure. So I'll sign up, so confirming your information. So I'm just going to say not sure for my intended use and click submit. There, feedback sent. So we're now setting up the account. And as I say, it does take a bit of a while to do some things like setting up virtual machines, setting up Cosmos DB databases and so forth. But eventually you will get into the Microsoft Azure account. And this is the Quick Start Center. So you could have a look at each of these if you want to find out how to create a web account, deploy virtual machines, set up a database and so forth. However, I'm going to actually ignore all of this. And indeed, there is another section, take an online course. So this is good, but it's probably not focused for what we're doing in DP-900. I'll show you near the end of this course something by Microsoft, which is a lot more focused. Instead, I'm going to click on this home button, and this is where I will generally start each of these practical videos. So as I say, you don't actually have to do any of these practical things to get the certification, but it probably helps if you know what's happening. And I'm also generally going to expand this menu as well, so you can see we can quickly get access to things like SQL databases, Azure Cosmos databases, and other things. So let's just take a quick look around Microsoft Azure. So as I say, this is a quick way of getting to common places, like for instance cost management and billing. So if you're worried how much things are going to cost, well, don't worry, you've got information there. You can click on all services, so you're not just restricted to the little bits that you see. So if I wanted to go to storage or databases, they're all clickable there. Alternatively, I could just click at the top and search for a particular resource. So maybe I'm looking for an Azure SQL database, and you can see it's now suggesting SQL databases as a suggestion. Over here, we have got a command line interface. We'll use that later, but very briefly, the shell is not much used in the certification, but you will be required to know things about it. Over here, we have got your directory and subscription, so just information about what you're on. Currently, we're on the free trial. Then we've got notifications, so what is currently happening. So anything that happens, if you set up anything, you'll get a notification that it's being set up, and then it has been set up. We have got various settings. So where do you want to be is probably the biggest setting. So do you want to start at home, which I generally do, or do you want to start on your own created dashboard? So these are little elements that you pin to a dashboard. What theme do you want? That could be quite useful if, for instance, you need a dark theme or a high contrast theme. Question mark, this gives you various helps, and then let us know how you are getting on. And then right at the end, we have your sign out button. So this is a quick look around Azure, and in the next video, we're going to start using Azure. We're going to install a new database with some sample data. In this video, we're going to create our very first server. And this being the DP900 course, we're going to create an Azure SQL database. So I'm here in the Home tab of the portal, which I have blown up quite a bit, so everybody can see it if you're using a mobile device, for instance. And I'm going to go to SQL databases. So I could click at the top in the search and type in SQL databases. So here you can see it. Or I could click on this hamburger icon, the 3 lines on the left-hand side, and go to SQL databases that way. Or I can hover over any existing SQL databases icons that you see and go to create. So however you're going to do that, I will just go to SQL database, SQL databases, and here I'm in SQL databases, and I can create a new database by clicking on create SQL database at the bottom or click on create at the top. So here I am creating an SQL database. Now the first thing it needs is a subscription. So you'll probably have a free trial subscription. If you don't, then you should select whatever subscription you have. So a subscription allows you to group together various resources which are then built together. Next, we need a resource group. Now, the advantage of a resource group, all of the resources that we create go into a single group. So if I no longer need the resources, I don't have to delete the resources individually. I can get rid of the entire resource group, and that gets rid of all of the resources within that resource group. So even though we're going to be creating lots of different things in connection with an SQL database, if they're in a particular resource group and I delete it, I also delete the SQL database and everything that it relies on. So I'm going to click on create new, as I don't have an existing resource group, and I'm going to call this SQL database. There I typed it in the name. You can see it's fine. There's a check mark on the right hand side, and click OK, and it says that the resource group is brackets new SQL database. Now it's not actually created the resource group yet. It will create it when it's creating the database. If I scroll down, it needs the database details. Now the database needs a name. I'm going to type in the letter A. And is that a valid name? And you can see, yes, it is. The database should not match special patterns, so you probably couldn't call it database, for example. It's got to have up to 128 characters. It can't contain certain reserved words, and no database with the same name should exist in the server. Now, before creating the database name, we really need to create the server. So the server stores one or more databases. So I'm going to click on Create New under Select a Server. So first of all, we need to create a server name. Now this needs to be unique across the entirety of Azure SQL servers. So I can't just call it, for instance, server because somebody is already using it. So I'm going to call it Test SQL Database DP 900, and hopefully that hasn't been used, and there you can see it is available. So you can see that the server is named Test SQL Database dp900.database.windows.net, and that's what I'm going to use to interact with it later. So you might want to make a note of it now. Next, I need a location for the database. Well, I'm going to store it in one of my local regions, so I'm going to use UK South. After this, I need to say what authentication method I should use. When I logged into the Microsoft Azure portal, I used Azure Active Directory. And if you're going to use an Azure AD authentication, so that's short for Azure Active Directory, you would also need to set an Azure AD admin. However, the users that you've got here aren't necessarily the users that you will have. So for simplicity's sake for this video, I'm going to use SQL authentication. So here I need to say what is my admin login. So I can't use, for instance, SA. It can't be a typical system name like admin, administrator, SA, root, DB manager, login manager, and so on. So I'm going to call it DP900. And then I'm going to type in a password. And my password, I can't use the admin login name. So I can't use DP900, which I've just done. It needs to be at least 8 characters in length, but no more than 128, and must contain at least 3 of the 4 complexity requirements: uppercase letters, lowercase letters, numbers, and symbols. So I'm going to type in a different password, which should be fine, and type it twice, so everything matches. And again, you should have a copy of the server admin login and your password, as you'll need it in the future. So let's click OK. So there is my server, the Test SQL Database DP900. I'm going to save this password. And now I can type in a database name. So it's got to be unique within this particular server. So I'm just going to call it DP900 because there aren't any databases in that server. Next, it asks, do you want to use the SQL Elastic Pool? We'll have a look at that later in this course. Now, it used to be that I would say just use the standard compute and storage settings. However, that has changed since the last time I recorded this video, and it now has an estimated cost of $430 US. So I am going to configure this database and change it from general purpose in the service tier down to standard, which is a much friendlier $18 per month. So I'm going to click apply. I'm going to leave everything else as is. Now, if I scroll to the very top, you'll see that there are additional tabs. So if I click on the networking tab, or I click next, which will get me to the next tab, you can see here we've got, for instance, network connectivity. I'm going to leave it as it is for the moment. We'll configure it later with no access. It's just going to give me the defaults. Security tab, again, this is more advanced. I'm not going to do anything with it for the purposes of this video. Additional settings. I want to use sample data. So under data source, use existing data. I've got the options of none, a backup from a previous database, and sample. So I'm going to click on sample. And you can see selecting this sample may modify the compute and storage settings. But when I click OK and go back to basics, you can see we still have the standard S0 at a cost of around $18 per month. So I'm going to leave everything else in additional settings tab as is. I'm not going to add any tags in the tags tab, and then go to review and create. And this then tells me what I am about to do. So you can scroll down this list and then click create. So you'll see that deployment is now in progress. It's going to actually take a few minutes to create this database. And you'll notice there's a little line underneath the notifications. So I can always click on the notifications icon to see what's happening. In the next video, we're going to connect to and query our Azure SQL database. Right, so after a couple of minutes, you can see deployment completed. So I can now go to the resource. So if I click on that button, you can see I can also pin this to the dashboard as well if I want to go back to it more easily. So I want to use this database, but first of all, I need to set the server firewall. So I'm going to click on it and you can see public access is disabled. That's because we set it as no access. So I'm going to say selected networks, and then I'm going to add my own computer, my own IP address as an allowable connection. So I'll click on add your client IPv4 Internet Protocol version 4 address. So I'll click on the add, and here you can see it. I've accidentally added it twice, so I can delete one of them just by clicking on the trash icon. So I'll click on save, and you can see updating the public network, server, firewall, and firewall rules. So that's fine. So now if I wanted to go back to the page I was on, I could click on overview on the left hand side. But what I want to do is query my database. So I'm going to go to my database. First of all, you notice I'm in an SQL server, not a database. To go to my database, I can go to SQL Databases on the left hand side, click on my database, and then I can go to Query Editor. Now I'm in my SQL database. So if you don't see it on a different screen, it's because you might be in the SQL Server as opposed to the SQL database. So if I click on Query Editor and type in my login and password and click OK. So I'm under SQL Server Authentication, as that is what I have set up. Here you can see I have got a query window. And if I expand my tables, you can see I've got various tables in my sample data. So in this window, I'm going to type one of the simplest select statements I can think of. Select star from, and I'm going to use sales LT dot address. So I just need to click on it to finish entering it, or I can press tab. Either way will work. And then I'll click on run. And here we can see my results. Now I can also use other programs as well. If I go back to the overview, so my unsaved edits will be discarded, that's fine. And I copy my server name, so I go near it and you can see that there is a copy to clipboard icon. So if I click this, and if I now open up SQL Server Management Studio, for example, I can paste in my server name under server name, change the authentication from Windows Authentication to SQL Server Authentication, and type in my login, my username, and my password. I can also check remember password if I wish to do so. Click on connect. Expand databases. Here we can see in the Object Explorer my DP900 database, and if I expand that and expand tables, here we can see all of my tables. It will take a little while because it is retrieving them online. It's not as swift as if it was an on-premises database. And I'll go to New Query at the top. I could also right and click on my database and go to New Query. Make sure you are in the right database. So currently I'm in the master database. I want to change that to the DP900 database. And I will type in again, select star from, and I will drag in this time sales lt.address, click execute. And here we can see the result. And then finally, I will do this with another program called Azure Data Studio. So here it is. And I will create a connection to a database instance. And the connection type is going to be Microsoft SQL Server. Paste in my server again. I will say it's an SQL login authentication type. and type in my username and password. I can change the database I'm connecting to by clicking on the drop down and saying I want the DP900 database on this particular server. I will leave all the rest as is, encrypt true, trust server certificate false, click connect. And now I can type in my new query by clicking on new query and typing in my query. So select star from sales lt dot address and then clicking on run. I can also use my SQL database from other programs such as Visual Studio or Excel. So in Excel, I would go to data, and in the data tab, I would get data from database, from SQL Server Database, enter my server name, enter the database optionally. I could, if I wanted to enter an SQL statement, I could put that in the advanced options SQL statement, but I'm not going to do this time. Click OK. It will then ask me for what sort of authentication am I going to use. I'm not going to use a Windows authentication. I'm going to use an SQL database authentication. Again, put in my username and my password. Click connect. And I want to query, for instance, the sales lt.address. So I can load the data, I can transform the data if I want to use Power Query and manipulate the data. But in this case, I'm just going to load the data and it loads here in my Excel spreadsheet. So let's review what we've done. We have gone to the Microsoft Azure portal. We've created an SQL database, also known as an Azure SQL database. We have given it sample data. We have set the server firewall, allowing our own IP address as part of the firewall. We've given it a username and password, and we have run a select statement in the query editor inside Azure, within SQL Server Management Studio, SSMS, within Azure Data Studio, and within Excel. So that's a lot of progress that we've made. So we've done a lot of things in these videos. So what's next? Well, you may know what a database is. You know that it contains tables, views, and stored procedures, and you know how to write a select statement. However, this might be your first time that you've got some potential hands-on experience with creating a database. So now we've got to this position where we've got an Azure SQL database. I'm going to go back a few stages and take things a lot more slowly. So in future sections, we're going to have a look at the characteristics of relational database, in other words, tables, primary and foreign keys, normalization, indexes, views, that sort of thing. We're also going to have a look at some of the programs that you can use for querying relational databases and the differences between them. But next, we're going to go back to our Azure SQL database and have a look at the select statement. Well, thank you very much for watching this video. In my DP900 course, I'll be going into much greater depth. I'll be describing query techniques for data using the SQL language. I will then be looking at relational data workloads like SQL Server and other Azure relational databases, before going on to non-relational databases. For example, Cosmos DB, before having a look at Data Warehouse and Power BI. At the end of the course, with a bit of practice and taking the official MeasureUp.com practice exam, you could go for the official Microsoft DP900 certification, all about Microsoft Azure data. That would look good on your CV or resume. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. In the next video, we're going to have a look around SSMS, SQL Server Management Studio, so you can see how you can use it with relation to your Microsoft Azure database. If you enjoyed this video, then please like it. And why not click subscribe and click that bell? That way you'll be notified of any new videos. I'm Philip Burton for idodata.com. Thank you for watching this, and I hope to see you in our DP900 course. Keep learning.